Welcome to our channel. Today we're diving into the riveting story of the Guggenheim family, a name that once rivaled even the Rockefellers in wealth and influence. It all began with Meyer Guggenheim, a Swiss immigrant who arrived in America with humble beginnings, only to build a colossal mining and smelting empire that stretched from Colorado to Chile. By the early 1900s, the Guggenheims were billionaires in today's money, second only to the Rockefellers, but behind their fame and fortune lie tales of family feuds, devastating tragedies, and hidden intrigues. From the Titanic disaster that claimed Benjamin Guggenheim's life to the internal disputes over inheritances, this dynasty has experienced its fair share of drama, on par with families like the Astors and Onassis. Over time, they channeled their vast resources into transformative philanthropy, birthing icons like the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum and the Peggy Guggenheim Collection, forever changing the worlds of art and aviation. What secret struggles and hidden legacies linger beneath the surface of this influential family? Stick around to discover how one immigrant's dream became a moldy generational empire, spanning industry, culture, and some of the most enduring mysteries in modern history. If you're ready for a deep dive into power, wealth, and untold family secrets, be sure to hit that subscribe button and join us on this remarkable journey. Picture the late 1800s in Colorado's mining regions, a time of frenzied prospecting and fortunes lost or found in the blink of an eye. All across the West, people swarmed in hopes of striking silver, gold, or any valuable ore the mountains would yield. Smelters belched smoke under sun-scorched skies, and rough camps sprang up almost overnight, each promising to be the next boomtown. Into this chaotic, high-stakes environment stepped Meyer Guggenheim, who had previously ventured into various smaller enterprises, but quickly recognized that real money, colossal, world-changing money, was up for grabs in mining. According to accounts passed down through local lore, he supposedly engaged in underhanded tactics, specifically by exploiting Native American land rights and bribing officials in Colorado's Leadville mines. That's the first spark of controversy. Did Guggenheim employ hidden negotiations and palm greasing to carve out an empire? Many suspect yes, but records are fragmented and official confirmations elusive, so the truth is cloaked in an intriguing air of mystery. From the moment Meyer Guggenheim arrived on the Leadville scene, his approach was described by those who witnessed it as fearless, if not downright aggressive. He seemed to have a knack for securing properties at lightning speed, often at bargain prices, then announcing their sudden rise in value shortly thereafter. One standout example is the acquisition of something called the 1879 AY mine. People whispered that the deal happened with suspicious quickness and minimal public scrutiny, leading to all sorts of speculation. Was this an incredible stroke of luck and business savvy, or the result of skillful manipulation behind closed doors? Supporters of the official wholesome narrative argue that Guggenheim simply outsmarted the competition, but critics see more sinister moves, including side payments to local politicians. For the sake of his public image, these rumors might have been swept under the rug. After all, no rising mogul wants the words bribery and corruption swirling around them. In discussing shady deals, we can't gloss over the deeply troubling mention of exploiting Native American land claims. Even though this period in history was notorious for displacing indigenous communities, often through coerced treaties, relocation, or the outright ignoring of their land rights, it's still jarring to hear specific allegations that the Guggenheim fortune might partially rest on forcibly marginalized landholders losing everything they had. Were these claims systematically snatched or at least acquired under heavily skewed conditions? That's a question many local historians have asked. noticing that certain mining parcels changed hands at suspiciously low costs, right around the time the rightful occupants were displaced. Such transactions often left no explicit paper trail admitting unethical steps, so we're left piecing together partial records, anecdotal accounts, and the broader context of rampant exploitation in Western expansion. Yet the rumor persists that Meyer Guggenheim was among those who took full advantage of murky legal frameworks to ensure that once native communities were pushed out, he stepped in to claim the riches below ground. Now let's consider how this might compare to others in the new money wave of that era, individuals who rose to prominence without inheriting an aristocratic background. The text urging us to compare Guggenheim's rumored methods to William Randolph Hearst's war-stoking journalism offers a clear hint. Like Hearst, Guggenheim belonged to a class of bold entrepreneurs who used unorthodox, sometimes morally dubious techniques to build their wealth. Hearst famously manipulated media coverage, fueling conflict to sell more papers and fortify his political influence. In a similar vein, Meyer Guggenheim allegedly manipulated local power structures. Only instead of controlling headlines, he controlled access to critical mining assets. Back then, if you nabbed the best mines or controlled a region's smelting infrastructure, you essentially held the economic lifeblood of an entire community. It's not hard to imagine that local officials might be swayed by cash-filled envelopes, promises of future profits, or other perks to reinterpret land titles or ensure that licensing processes went smoothly. Yet for all the salacious talk of bribery, hush money, and land exploitation, there's a glaring lack of definitive records. Book accounts sometimes refer to credible but sparse evidence, indicating that while multiple clues line up to suggest wrongdoing, there's no single smoking gun that says here is the full blueprint of Meyer Guggenheim's illegal strategies. Some might argue that the reason for that is simple. Nobody at the time wanted their name tied directly to a scandal that could spoil their entire future. So deals were done verbally or disguised through elaborate intermediaries. Perhaps unscrupulous business was simply how the game was played. In the late 19th century, the American West was rife with corruption and far from the watchful eye of federal oversight. In that atmosphere, developing an empire meant forging alliances, making donations, and cutting corners. It's entirely plausible that many men of Meyer Guggenheim's caliber operated similarly. Only a few of them were big enough names for us to still gossip about a century later. This hush-hush approach to the 1879 AY mine acquisition is a prime example of how quickly these deals transpired and then vanished from the public's view. One day the mine's ownership changed. Almost immediately, the property was consolidated into Guggenheim's growing portfolio. Official statements at the time might have framed the purchase as a savvy move by a visionary capitalist. Yet behind the scenes, local rumor mills churned out stories of extracurricular incentives for those controlling property records, or for officials who could expedite certain legal documents. In frontier mining towns, the concept of a firm paper trail could be laughable. Things were fluid, chaotic, and subject to whichever well-funded interests stepped in. All the while, the Guggenheim name was being groomed to stand for family values, philanthropic endeavors, and business acumen. Indeed, in the decades that followed, the family would become synonymous with large-scale philanthropy, sponsoring museums and foundations dedicated to the arts, culture, and progress. Their legacy in the public eye gradually shifted away from the hustling and risk-taking that marked their earliest days, focusing instead on the massive philanthropic achievements the family championed. It's easy to see how once the family had cemented its reputation as patrons of the arts, just think of the grand galleries bearing their name. Any recollections of forced land deals or bribery in some small Colorado town would barely make a ripple in the greater historical narrative. And yet, certain local accounts from Colorado keep the memory alive. Town historians occasionally revisit the swirl of allegations, sifting through property deeds, old meeting notes, and local newspaper archives. In those writings, you'll see the repeated question: were we all bamboozled by a well-funded outsider who dazzled officials, consolidated a strategic portion of our region's mineral wealth, then moved on to bigger markets? Some say the hush money used to keep these deals under wraps allowed the family to project an air of respectability, skipping over any messy conflicts that might tarnish their standing. Others argue that this is overblown rumor, that Guggenheim's success stemmed from legitimate savvy in picking winning investments, and that any shady whispers are simply how folks in a boom and bust mining town rationalize someone striking it rich. After all, big success often sparks envy and conspiracies. But does envy and conspiracy alone explain repeated references to bribed officials and coerced Native American landholders? There's a substantial difference between typical tall tales and consistent patterns of allegations across different times and sources. If there's a kernel of truth, what does that say about the empire built atop it? We might think of similar tales from that era, like the rumors swirling around railroad tycoons and steel barons who boasted about acquiring land or deals fairly, even as their critics pointed to an array of manipulations. Some families overcame that unflattering backstory through philanthropic contributions so vast that public perception shifted. The Guggenheims, with their future philanthropic wave, also achieved a carefully sculpted public image, one that emphasized their passion for the arts, scientific research, and civic betterment. Bombs in the mail, an influential Jewish family on edge, and a city grappling with underlying prejudice. There's no subtle buildup here. We're diving straight into the chilling reality of 1905, when explosives were quietly sent to Emsa Guggenheim's son's New York offices. At the time, Meyer Guggenheim was known for parlaying humble immigrant roots into a global mining and smelting empire, while financier Jacob Schiff was likewise prominent in banking circles. Yet their success and Jewish background made them targets of a calculated act of hate. According to accounts from major newspapers of the era, these bombs aimed to intimidate, or worse, strike at the heart of what some perceived as too much power, concentrated in the hands of a Jewish industrial family and a leading Jewish financier. The Guggenheims, already aware that public trust was fragile, made the deliberate choice to keep news of these threats as quiet as possible. After all, in an America rife with nativist sentiments and anti-Semitic undercurrents, going public might have inflamed further hostility or fueled sensational press coverage that investors, business partners, and even employees might find deeply unsettling. This was a time when a single headline could stir mass panic, and for the Guggenheims, that risk was enormous. They had multiple operations under the umbrella of M. Guggenheim's sons and were expanding at an astonishing pace in places like Colorado, Utah, and even as far south as Chile. Large-scale mining and smelting projects, especially the family's roles in ventures like the American Smelting and Refining Company, were inextricably tied to global markets. Any scandal involving bomb threats, especially ones tainted by anti-Semitism, could jeopardize lucrative contracts or business negotiations. In private, the family must have held tense discussions about ramping up security without broadcasting their vulnerability. Researchers and historians often note that In an era before modern public relations, families like the Guggenheims essentially handled PR themselves, meaning their decisions on disclosure versus secrecy followed a logic that balanced business, personal safety, and social perception. The Guggenheims weren't alone in this. A quick look at other industrial dynasties of the time shows that more than a few had episodes they tried to bury. The DuPonts, for example, were dogged by rumors about inbreeding and other hush-hush concerns, while the Astors had public family rifts. Yet for the Guggenheims, the 1905 bomb threats remain one of the starkest examples of how intolerance and business success could collide in a terrifying way. If we fast forward to modern research, we find that certain archives, including periodicals from the New York Times, contain scattered mentions of anti-Semitic harassment directed at wealthy Jewish families around the turn of the century. One sees references to suspicious packages, threatening letters, and in some rare instances, physical attacks against property. Many of these stories didn't become front-page news, partly because of editorial decisions to avoid giving extremists a platform, and partly because the victims themselves sometimes exerted influence or chose to stay quiet. The Guggenheims were in a prime position to lean on their connections, quietly notifying the authorities while downplaying or outright quashing any sensational coverage. But let's consider how nerve-wracking it must have been for anyone working in those offices, or for family members hearing about bombs discreetly intercepted. This was no idle threat. An actual device arriving in the mail, presumably capable of inflicting real harm. We can easily imagine hushed corridors, managers warning employees not to discuss the matter outside the workplace, and a swirl of rumors about who might be behind it all. Was it an individual crank? A small group fueled by anti-Semitic literature? Or did it stem from a broader conspiracy against Jewish industrialists? The truth, as often happens, remains murky. Historians emphasize that while the attacks are well documented as anti-Semitic, there is no firm proof of a grand conspiracy. Still, even a lone perpetrator with a bomb is plenty terrifying. Meyer Guggenheim, the family patriarch, had immigrated from Switzerland and started with something as modest as a peddler's background, only to accumulate immense wealth through relentless investment in mining. By 1905, the Guggenheim name was no longer obscure. They were forging a path that would soon place them on par with other industrial titans like the Rockefellers and Carnegies. Because of that heightened visibility, or perhaps in spite of it, they found themselves under attack. Jacob Schiff, a towering figure in finance, also wasn't a random add-on to the target list. He was well known for his banking acumen and philanthropic pursuits, which encompassed supporting Jewish educational initiatives and various social causes. Such high-profile involvement, while beneficial to countless communities, also painted a bullseye for bigots who believed that Jewish financiers and industrialists were wielding too much influence. To grasp the environment of that era, we should remember that immigration numbers in the United States had soared in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with many newcomers being Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe. The general public's response was mixed. Some Americans embraced the wave of new talent and labor, while others fanned the flames of xenophobia. Anti-Semitism in the U.S. didn't manifest on the same horrific scale as in parts of Europe, but it was hardly absent. Restrictive covenants, social clubs that excluded Jewish members, and scapegoating of Jewish entrepreneurs were all part of the societal backdrop. Hence, receiving a bomb in the mail could be seen as the extreme end of a broader pattern of prejudice that ranged from snide remarks at high society gatherings to overt violence against property and individuals. What adds an extra layer of complexity is how the Guggenheims decided to respond. Rather than publicly denouncing the threats in an effort to rally condemnation, they essentially contained the crisis, presumably cooperating with the authorities behind closed doors. Perhaps they believed that shining a spotlight on the bombs would only incite further incidents. Or maybe they felt that their business empire, so reliant on partnerships, didn't need the negative publicity. The family's reticence makes it challenging for modern researchers to piece together every detail of the 1905 events. Yet we do know enough to confirm that it wasn't a trivial matter. Bombs are never a casual threat, especially when loaded with a vicious undertone of anti-Semitism. Drawing parallels to other high-status families is instructive in understanding the hush-hush approach. The DuPonts, for instance, face swirling rumors about their genealogical practices, leading them to clamp down on personal disclosures. The Onassis family, in a slightly different time and place, dealt with intense media scrutiny that turned many private affairs into public drama. But for the Guggenheims in 1905, the situation was more dire than just rumors. It was a threat that could have exploded, both literally and metaphorically, if the bombs had detonated or if the press had seized on the sensational angle of Jewish moguls threatened by terrorists. It's also revealing to consider that bomb threats against industrial offices were not entirely unknown in an era of labor strife. Radical anarchist movements occasionally targeted big capitalist enterprises. However, the explicit targeting of Meyer Guggenheim and Jacob Schiff for their Jewish heritage sets these 1905 threats apart from purely labor-oriented attacks. There might have been cross-pollination between ideological disdain for capitalists and anti-Jewish sentiment, but the available evidence points strongly to faith-based hatred as the central motive, not simply anti-capitalist fervor. Benjamin Guggenheim was traveling on the Titanic with his mistress. That's exactly what makes his story so intriguing. People often highlight his noble final moments, describing how he dressed in evening wear and faced the ship's doom like a gentleman. Yet behind that polished legend lurked a hidden piece of scandal. A young French singer named Léontine Aubard, quietly accompanying him on the most infamous voyage of 1912. For decades, her presence wasn't talked about much. The public saw Benjamin Guggenheim as a gallant figure who helped women and children into lifeboats and calmly accepted his fate, leaving the messy truth about his personal life in the shadows. Today, however, we know enough to say that yes, he was indeed on board with a lover, and the Guggenheim family very likely preferred it remain hush-hush, overshadowed by tales of his chivalrous sacrifice. Reports say Léontine Aubard was a charming singer, younger than Benjamin Guggenheim by a notable margin. They boarded Titanic together, though obviously not as an openly romantic couple, and the plan was likely to enjoy a luxurious voyage across the ocean. It was supposed to be a glamorous trip on an unsinkable ship, right? No one anticipated the iceberg that would shatter those illusions in the dead of night. As the world later learned, more than 1,500 souls were lost, plunging entire families into grief. In that aftermath, with so many survivors struggling to cope, any scandal might have stayed in the background simply because the scale of death was so overwhelming. But for Titanic buffs, and for those who track the personal dramas behind historical events, Benjamin Guggenheim's secret travel companion remains an irresistible subplot, one that stands out precisely because it was overshadowed at the time. When people recall Benjamin Guggenheim, they often invoke his final hours. Multiple survivors mention that he helped others into lifeboats, refused to board one himself, and changed into formal attire, supposedly saying something along the lines of, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." Newspapers seized on that narrative. A man known for wealth faced mortality with composure. Who wouldn't celebrate such a graceful exit? But quietly, whispers circulated about the woman traveling with him. Survivor testimony varies, but some mention a young French lady in his circle, sometimes identified only as a singer, sometimes going unnamed altogether. Over time, further research revealed she was Leontine Aubar, and she did survive the disaster, presumably boarding a lifeboat at Guggenheim's insistence. Why, then, was her name rarely mentioned in mainstream accounts right after the sinking? The simplest answer is that families like the Guggenheims had the resources and influence to ensure certain stories took center stage, while others were minimized. In 1912, the press was far less invasive than it might be today. They didn't have paparazzi swarming the docks in New York or combing through every detail of passengers' personal lives. The story of the Titanic's mechanical failure, the negligence that led to the collision, and the enormous human toll all overshadowed smaller, more personal scandals. Meanwhile, the Guggenheim family was known to protect its public image. Like many dynasties of the Gilded Age, they valued discretion. If you consider how quickly rumors of extramarital affairs could spread and tarnish reputations, it's plausible they nudged coverage away from the mistress angle, or simply benefited from the overshadowing effect of a colossal tragedy. Yet it's not as though the rumor died forever. Historians who dig through Titanic archives, survivor interviews, and any leftover correspondence eventually notice references to Ben Guggenheim's friend. Some accounts hint that she was distressed and that he calmed her, urging her to board a lifeboat, making sure she and other women under his care were saved. The gallantry that newspapers praised wasn't purely about him helping strangers. He was also focused on saving a woman he deeply cared for, even though she wasn't his wife. The irony is that this private, scandalous detail subtly underscores his final show of courage. It adds a layer of humanity. Far from a purely chivalric statue, he was a man with desires and complexities, right there in the middle of a crisis that tested everyone's morals and instincts. In many ways, the Titanic was a microcosm of early 20th century society. Aristocrats, magnates, and celebrities, all crammed onto an unsinkable ocean liner. It's no surprise that personal dramas abounded. John Jacob Astor IV's presence alone drew headlines, especially because he'd recently divorced and married a much younger woman who was pregnant during the voyage. Back then, that kind of marital scandal was huge, but the scale of the Titanic's sinking was so vast that even the Astor story wound up overshadowed by the general horror of the event. Imagine how easy it would be for the Guggenheims to keep quiet about an affair, especially if that affair didn't involve a new, high-profile marriage or an unborn child. Simply letting the bigger tragedy dominate the narrative might have sufficed. Then, by focusing on Benjamin's gentlemanly demise, the story of an extramarital relationship fell into the background. Still, many wonder whether there was an active cover-up or if this was just a case of public priorities shifting in the face of an enormous catastrophe. Some Titanic enthusiasts speculate that hush money changed hands, or that letters Aubar wrote after the sinking were quietly confiscated or destroyed. Others say that it wasn't necessary to orchestrate a grand conspiracy. The heartbreak and magnitude of the tragedy naturally minimized the salacious details. We do know that the Guggenheims were wealthy enough to manipulate news coverage if they really wanted to. Yet the sinking was the biggest story on Earth at that moment. A single extramarital twist wouldn't necessarily have outcompeted hundreds of horrifying accounts from survivors describing how the ship cracked apart or how lifeboats were launched only half full. In short, The mistress factor could have gone unexploited by the press simply because so many were overwhelmed by the scale of loss. Either way, the affair itself is beyond doubt. Historians, diving into passenger logs and personal testimonies, have verified that Leontino Barr was his companion. A handful of references even confirm the depth of their relationship. She wasn't a mere casual friend. If you comb through certain letters or diaries from other passengers, you'll see hints that people traveling in first class were aware of what was happening, but chose not to discuss it openly. One reason for that reticence might be courtesy or fear of retribution from a powerful family. Another reason might be that the entire Titanic diaspora was reeling. Many survivors lost friends and relatives, and gossiping about an affair probably felt petty at best. Plus, the entire world's press zeroed in on bigger questions. Who was at fault? Why did the ship lack enough lifeboats? Could the tragedy have been avoided if they'd slowed down or heeded iceberg warnings? We can't overlook how Leontine must have felt. She survived, which meant going on with her life after witnessing the unimaginable. Did she attempt to speak out about her role in Guggenheim's final hours? Did she keep quiet, either by her own choice or because she was pressured to do so? Some accounts suggest she returned to Europe, perhaps continuing to perform, or maybe slipping into a more discreet existence. The emotional impact must have been immense, losing a lover in such a public tragedy, then watching as the world turned him into a symbol of gentlemanly sacrifice while barely acknowledging her existence. It's reminiscent of how other women in high society often vanish from the narrative, overshadowed by a need to maintain a pristine front. Of course, not everyone is convinced there was an active, purposeful cover-up. Some historians say that the simplest explanation is that once Benjamin Guggenheim died, the impetus to delve into his personal affairs died with him. The Titanic left thousands of individual tragedies in its wake, and the press or investigators had a limited bandwidth. But it's not a stretch to think the Guggenheim family would prefer a sanitized version of events. They had philanthropic ambitions, later supporting major cultural institutions like the museums bearing their name. If negative publicity surfaced, especially an affair happening right at the moment of such a massive disaster, it could have clashed with their philanthropic image. That alone might have been reason enough to keep the mistress detail off the record. Yet here we are, over a century later, giving voice to the piece that got buried. Through diaries, secondhand testimonies, Titanic research websites, and even modern re-examinations, we discover that, sure enough, Benjamin Guggenheim didn't go down as a solitary hero. He left behind a woman who, had things gone differently, might have held a far more visible place in his life. The fact that modern Titanic enthusiasts unearth these details underscores how the sinking remains a bottomless well of stories, some uplifting, some heartbreaking, some downright scandalous. It's that mosaic of personal dramas that draws us in, more than a straightforward account of a ship hitting an iceberg. On a quiet day in 1928, an unfathomable tragedy struck in the heart of New York City. Peggy Guggenheim, an emerging figure soon to be hailed for her patronage of modern art, suddenly found herself in the midst of a nightmare. Her two sons, Terence, 4.5 years old, and Benjamin, 14 months old, fell from the roof of a 16-story hotel and plunged to their deaths. By all official accounts, this catastrophe was labeled a horrible accident. Yet rumors of neglect or even outright foul play circulated in hushed tones, with some alleging that the Guggenheim family's considerable influence helped sweep uncomfortable questions under the rug. If you do a bit of historical digging, you can uncover references in early 20th century newspaper archives, including the New York Times, which apparently gave some coverage to whispers of suspicious circumstances before the story was partially dialed down. The notion that the Guggenheims, already a family name entangled with wealth, tragedy, and gossip, could be covering up an even more unsettling narrative sparked interest among both the public and the press. So why is this particular incident so intriguing, especially when the official line was simply an accident? First, we're talking about a dynasty that had already seen its fair share of drama. Peggy Guggenheim, as many people now know, wasn't just an average socialite. She was part of the formidable Guggenheim clan, known for their mining and smelting fortunes, their deep involvement in philanthropic endeavors, and, in some corners, a rumored Guggenheim curse that seemed to follow the family wherever they went. Just the phrase Guggenheim curse alone has popped up on various blogs, lore sites, and even a handful of tabloid-style articles, linking multiple tragic events across generations of the family, some of which parallel the fabled misfortunes of the Onassis or Astor families. Let's situate ourselves in Peggy's life around 1928. According to well-known biographical sketches, Peggy was born in 1898 and was the daughter of Benjamin Guggenheim, who famously perished on the RMS Titanic in 1912. That event was already part of the Guggenheim family's string of dark moments. Benjamin reportedly insisted that other passengers be saved, a heroic but ultimately fatal choice. Peggy herself grew up in a wealthy yet distinctly bohemian milieu, mingling with artists, writers, and freethinkers. By the late 1920s, though, she was still shaping her own destiny and establishing her personal life apart from the broader family empire. In 1928, Peggy's sons, Terrence and Benjamin, somehow ended up on the roof of a 16-story New York hotel and fell to their deaths. The official conclusion was that they accidentally slipped or tumbled from the roof's edge. Coroner reports, which are rarely publicized in detail, but occasionally surface in references from historical archives, apparently indicated no direct sign of intentional harm. But that didn't stop the swirl of rumors. Some rumors suggested that a caretaker or nanny had turned away for just a moment, resulting in a devastating lapse of supervision. Others hinted at more sinister possibilities, pointing to the often whispered hush-hush dynamic within the Guggenheim clan. Maybe Peggy herself was in emotional turmoil, or maybe there were financial or familial conflicts overshadowing the children's well-being. According to commentary that has appeared in various genealogical and historical forums, it's possible that the family tried very hard to keep the tragedy from ballooning into a public scandal. Even the mention in the New York Times allegedly noting whispers of neglect or foul play eventually faded from the front pages. As some narratives go, the Guggenheims, being quite influential both socially and financially, had the means to limit the scope of coverage, ensuring that the broader public accepted the accident explanation without too much fuss. And in the 1920s America, money and reputation certainly went a long way toward shaping how law enforcement and newspapers approached a story. That said, it's important to reiterate that every official document we know of, from coroner notes to brief police statements, pointed to an accident. There is no indisputable evidence of murder or purposeful harm. Even so, the lack of transparent details fed the rumor mill, especially among those enthralled with the idea of a Guggenheim curse. After all, Peggy's father died on the Titanic, and other Guggenheim relatives faced a range of bizarre incidents and tragedies over the years, from mysterious illnesses to untimely deaths. Some tabloid-like columns at the time even blamed bad blood or divine retribution for the family's repeated heartbreaks. The Onassis and Astor families famously had their own legends of curses, with multiple shocking losses building an aura of doom around their dynasties. The Guggenheims, while not as frequently spotlighted in modern gossip pages, have certainly been whispered about in a similar vein. To understand how this storyline became so cloaked in speculation, we have to look at who Peggy Guggenheim was beyond being just an heiress. Biographers describe her as a bold personality, someone who in the following decades would champion emerging artists like Jackson Pollock and Max Ernst, whom she married at one point. Her life was anything but sedate. She hopped from social scene to social scene, financed cutting-edge art, and by 1938 she was moving to Paris to dive deeper into the European avant-garde movement. So in many ways, Peggy was forging a path that was entirely unique, far from the more traditional philanthropic image upheld by some of her relatives, like the famous Solomon R. Guggenheim, who later established the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York. Yet in 1928, she was still in the thick of personal and familial entanglements. She was not some distant bohemian figure who had cut all ties with her background. She carried the name, and with that came certain expectations and, unavoidably, certain judgments. The roof from which the children fell was said to have had a low parapet or minimal railing, at least according to a few architecture enthusiasts who've posted on specialized historical building forums. Safety standards in the 1920s definitely weren't what they are now, so tragic accidents of this nature, while deeply disturbing, were not entirely unheard of. One major question that keeps surfacing among people who research the what-ifs is why two very young children were on the roof in the first place. Was a caretaker momentarily distracted? Did Terrence, being 4.5, somehow lead his baby brother near the edge out of curiosity? Or did something more sinister occur? The rumors about neglect suggest that perhaps the caretaker was absent or otherwise occupied. The rumors of foul play go even further, implying that the family's enormous wealth could have masked an internal conflict or personal vendetta. When you compare this to other wealthy families known for drama, like the Onassis clan, with all its maritime tragedies and bitter inheritance feuds, there's a parallel in how speculation often outpaces confirmed fact. For the Onassis name, countless tabloids and sensational books proposed elaborate conspiracy theories about plane crashes and sudden deaths, even though official investigations mostly pointed to tragic accidents or health issues. With the Guggenheims, we get a similar dynamic. The known facts, 2 children died by falling from a great height, become overshadowed by swirling insinuations. And because the Guggenheims were so prominent, it's not surprising that folks latched onto any angle that might indicate a hidden scandal or a secret family feud. It's also worth noting that certain genealogical blogs refer to the Guggenheim curse, attributing a series of unfortunate events to some kind of supernatural or karmic retribution. In more mainstream historical discourse, talk of a curse is generally viewed as a flourish added by rumor mongers. Nonetheless, it resonates with people who see these unstoppable tragedies converging around one dynasty. The year 1928 in particular stands out as a pivot point for Peggy. Right after the children's deaths, her path took a more determined, if not defiant, turn. Instead of allowing heartbreak to drown her, she poured herself into forging connections with the artistic vanguard, collecting art that would become foundational to several major museums. Some might argue that her immersion in the arts was an attempt to find meaning or solace after losing her sons. Others interpret it as a rebellious pivot away from the gloom that her family name carried, as though she sought a new identity untainted by the money and sorrow of the Guggenheim heritage. Peggy had a reputation for being fiercely independent, and her romantic entanglements were nothing if not complicated. Some historical accounts, referencing diaries or personal letters, hint that her family life was tumultuous around that period. Could that have contributed in some indirect way to the children's lack of supervision? Possibly. But direct allegations that she or someone close to her orchestrated foul play remain purely in the realm of speculation, never backed by concrete evidence. Even the New York Times, which was known for fairly extensive society columns at the time, didn't publish a definitive accusation, just a nod to the fact that some onlookers found the official story a bit too tidy. Despite all the hush-hush elements, one cannot ignore the heartbreak factor. 2 young children died, which is unimaginable sorrow for any parent, no matter how rich or influential they are. Whatever the swirl of rumors, it's clear that Peggy endured a deep personal loss that could have shaped her trajectory in the years that followed. Perhaps she carried guilt, whether or not she was directly responsible. Perhaps she felt a desperate need to break free from the stifling environment that reminded her of tragedy. Some researchers say that her channeling of grief into art patronage was a coping mechanism, an attempt to fill a void left by her children's passing. Others see it simply as an evolution of her bohemian spirit. But either way, those 2 short lives were cut off in a chilling manner that left behind unanswered questions and set tongues wagging across New York's social circles. Have you ever heard the story about Daniel Guggenheim being accused of war profiteering by none other than Henry Ford? It's one of those historical tidbits that tends to hover beneath the radar, overshadowed by bigger Gilded Age controversies, or overshadowed by the broader achievements and scandals of the Guggenheim dynasty. Yet if you open up certain pages of the Los Angeles Times archives, or dig through the heated exchanges of the early 1920s, you'll find that Henry Ford explicitly charged Daniel Guggenheim with profiteering during World War I, accusing him of inflating copper prices at a time when the public was told that prices were being lowered for the sake of the war effort. Even more intriguing, the Guggenheim family's public involvement with the Red Cross during the war was, according to Ford, conveniently used to deflect the worst of the criticism. But as soon as you mention Henry Ford's name, you have to wrestle with the fact that his anti-Semitic viewpoints, famously laid out in his writings such as The International Jew, muddy the waters of his claims. Did Daniel Guggenheim really scheme to make extra millions off war contracts? Or was Ford's bias fueling these accusations? People who care about fairness and historical accuracy have to consider both possibilities. The Guggenheim family was no stranger to public scrutiny. By 1920, they were already an industrial powerhouse, heavily involved in mining, smelting, and a host of other ventures that shaped entire regions' economies. Daniel Guggenheim himself oversaw portions of this empire, making vital decisions on copper production and pricing, decisions that reverberated through world markets, especially in times of war. World War I demanded enormous quantities of copper for bullets, shell casings, electrical wiring, communications equipment, and more. According to historians who've studied the raw materials side of the Great War, the price of copper was a serious factor in whether the Allied powers could maintain a steady supply of ammunition and machinery. If a major copper producer decided to hike the price, it could put significant strain on governments that were already bleeding resources. In Henry Ford's view, at least as documented in the Los Angeles Times coverage from around 1920, Daniel Guggenheim had promised that the family's copper interests would keep prices low for the war effort, presumably to show patriotism and help the Allies. But Ford alleged that behind the scenes, The Guggenheims kept prices higher than necessary, raking in profits while publicly claiming to be patriotic partners. Ford's statements appeared to be an extension of his broader narrative, laid out in The International Jew, which painted certain Jewish financiers and industrialists as manipulative figures, controlling vast resources to the detriment of everyday citizens. While The International Jew has been widely discredited for its blatant anti-Semitism, and while many historians have condemned Ford for these views, it remains a fact that he specifically singled out Daniel Guggenheim during his crusade. Contemporary newspaper articles mention that the Guggenheim family also turned around and highlighted their involvement with wartime charities, most notably the Red Cross, to prove that they weren't heartless profiteers. Archival references mention Guggenheim donations, fundraising efforts, and direct involvement in philanthropic causes meant to aid the war-torn populations in Europe. Yet it's worth asking, did those philanthropic gestures truly negate any possibility of profiteering, or were they a convenient public relations move to show moral standing? In any major conflict, industry magnates walk a fine line between making a profit, inevitable for large suppliers, and being accused of war profiteering. You can see a parallel in how DuPont, famous for gunpowder and other wartime materials, faced accusations of Confederate smuggling in the Civil War era. Historians often draw lines between these new money families who soared to immense wealth during national or global conflicts, igniting the question, how much of that fortune was earned ethically? Many modern historians encourage anyone studying these claims to dig into War Commission records, which detail how contracts were awarded, at what pricing, and who benefited from them. For instance, one might find official logs or documents from the U.S. War Industries Board, the body that attempted to coordinate American industrial output during World War I, or from the British government's side if Guggenheim copper made its way across the Atlantic. If the Guggenheims promised, for example, a copper price of X dollars per pound, but actually charged a higher figure under certain contract stipulations, that would be an objective measure of profiteering. However, scouring these records can get complicated. Not all are complete, some have conflicting data, and many were influenced by the chaotic nature of the war. That's why analyzing something like Ford's statements becomes all the more difficult. Some argue you can't dismiss them out of hand just because of Ford's personal prejudices, while others say his anti-Semitic worldview permeated everything he wrote, rendering it unreliable unless corroborated by neutral sources. Let's talk about The International Jew for a moment. Published in the early 1920s, this series of booklets and articles was Ford's attempt to expose what he saw as a global Jewish conspiracy. It rehashed countless anti-Semitic tropes and even built on the infamous discredited protocols of the Elders of Zion. Credible historians have repeatedly debunked Ford's claims, labeling them as hateful propaganda. When Ford accused Daniel Guggenheim of war profiteering, he did so within that broader context. He believed or wanted to convince others that wealthy Jewish businessmen were orchestrating events for personal gain, including the Great War itself. This is obviously a major red flag if you're looking for impartial testimony about Daniel Guggenheim's actions. On the other hand, some argue that even disreputable figures can sometimes stumble upon a nugget of truth. So, was Ford just latching onto the Guggenheims because they fit his narrative? Or was there evidence out there that Daniel Guggenheim indeed manipulated copper prices under the guise of patriotism? Citing a few references from that era, you'll find remarks that copper prices did fluctuate in surprising ways. The national press occasionally reported that, Yes, the Guggenheims had pledged to keep costs stable for war production, but certain supply contracts showed higher margins. Yet as soon as the war ended, the family pointed to philanthropic gestures like major contributions to the American Red Cross, official testimonies about how they'd pitched in for relief efforts in war-ravaged countries, and statements from soldiers who supposedly benefited from Guggenheim-funded programs. Some local and international newspapers wrote glowingly about the family's war contributions, praising them for stepping up when times were dire. Meanwhile, Ford turned up the volume on the profiteering narrative, accusing them and other families of hoarding massive wealth off the backs of soldiers. That tension never fully resolved in the public eye. Some people likely accepted the philanthropic story, while others swallowed or partially believed Ford's accusations. Adding to the complexity is the question of how the Guggenheims were perceived by the wider American public. The family, originally of Swiss Jewish descent, had integrated into mainstream American society, yet still faced anti-Semitic undercurrents. Henry Ford wasn't alone in harboring such sentiments. A portion of the population, especially in the early 20th century, was receptive to conspiracy theories about Jewish bankers or industrialists. So the fact that the Guggenheims were singled out might reflect both their visibility and the era's prejudice. Plus, the Guggenheim's overall success was a double-edged sword. It provided them with enormous influence and philanthropic reach, but it also fueled suspicion from critics who believed nobody could accumulate that much money legitimately. When Daniel Guggenheim rose to prominence in controlling the copper markets, it made him a prime target for those who wanted to point fingers at so-called war leeches. One angle people sometimes overlook: the Guggenheim's Red Cross involvement. Historical references point to the family making headline-worthy donations. They also provided logistical assistance, using their business networks to help ship medical supplies or raise awareness for relief. But as Ford alleged, this might have served as a shield against deeper inquiries into their profit margins. Corporations and wealthy families, both then and now, often channel philanthropic gestures to counterbalance negative publicity. According to certain blog discussions that analyze philanthropic patterns, it's not uncommon for big industrial players to give generously while they're making hefty profits behind the scenes. Philanthropy becomes part of a carefully managed image. The Los Angeles Times article that references Ford's accusations might also mention the timing of the Guggenheim's Red Cross visibility, implying that it ramped up precisely when tensions about copper prices were at their highest. One reason is that Henry Ford's broader anti-Semitic context tends to overshadow the specifics. Historians who want to be fair might see a kernel of truth in the pricing controversy, but they remain wary of citing Ford as a solid source. War Commission records, if thoroughly examined, could shed more light on whether actual policy statements from the Guggenheims contradicted their real pricing. But these records can be labyrinthine, incomplete, or uninterpretable without specialized knowledge of wartime economics. Also, the 1920s saw multiple congressional and journalistic inquiries into war profiteering among American industries. Some well-known robber barons were summoned to testify about how they managed wartime contracts. The Guggenheims, along with other big players, likely faced at least some questioning, though not all transcripts survive in detail. To get a sense of Ford's motivations, you can't avoid reading at least parts of The International Jew, which was serialized in Ford's newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. He outlined an overarching conspiracy theory about Jewish capitalists controlling media, finance, and politics, in which the Guggenheims logically fit as wealthy, influential Jewish industrialists. He singled out examples that he felt proved their manipulative power. If you read modern academic critiques by scholars from institutions like the University of Michigan or Wayne State University, they'll show how Ford took real incidents, like a big industrialist raising prices, and wove them into a narrative about global Jewish intrigue. That doesn't necessarily disprove the profiteering claim, but it certainly indicates a prejudiced framing. Additionally, Ford's own war-related stances can seem contradictory. He famously opposed the U.S. entering World War I and even sponsored a peace ship to Europe, yet he ended up manufacturing vehicles and equipment that eventually had military applications. So you have an individual who disliked war on principle, disliked Jewish financiers on prejudice, and singled out the Guggenheims when he felt they were exemplifying everything wrong with war-driven capitalism. We might also note that the Guggenheim family's philanthropic track record didn't end with the Red Cross. Over time, they funded museums, educational programs, and medical research. They established philanthropic foundations that exist to this day, awarding grants in various fields. People who focus on the benevolent side of the Guggenheims might see the war-era Red Cross support as a logical extension of a long-standing charitable inclination. They'd argue that the family simply recognized the suffering in Europe and responded generously. Conversely, critics might say that once you're making a fortune off war materials, it's easy to set aside a fraction of those profits for a charitable show. There's also the matter of how the Guggenheims responded after 1920. Did Daniel Guggenheim publicly refute Ford's accusations in detail, or did he let them slide, assuming that Ford's anti-Semitic leanings would damage his credibility anyway? Some old newspaper clippings suggest that the Guggenheims rarely dignified Ford's claims with formal rebuttals, preferring to focus on positive press about their philanthropic works, expansions in the copper industry, and so forth. Possibly they believed that stooping to Ford's level would only fuel the controversy. Meanwhile, the International Jew was widely circulated at the time, stoking suspicion of Jewish entrepreneurs. By refusing to engage, the Guggenheims might have been betting that the mainstream press, which recognized Ford's extremist views, wouldn't take the profiteering charge too seriously unless solid proof emerged. There's an argument that Daniel Guggenheim couldn't have single-handedly inflated copper prices without cooperation from other producers or from relevant government boards. The copper market, though heavily influenced by the Guggenheims, wasn't entirely under one family's control. If they hiked prices excessively, they risked undercutting demand or losing contracts to competitors. War procurement processes, as messy as they were, still required some oversight. So, if there was profiteering, it might have been more subtle, like incremental markups or various surcharges disguised in contract terms. That nuance is seldom addressed in the more sensational narratives. Ford's rhetorical style was more, "They're evil and out to rob the nation," than "They might have inflated prices by 5% and used philanthropic gestures to look good." Meanwhile, more careful critics would search for specifics, like a contract awarding a certain price per pound of copper that was in direct conflict with what the Guggenheims had publicly stated. Without a smoking gun, the profiteering claim remains in the realm of accusations rather than a confirmed scandal. Back in 2010, an audacious woman named Caterina Pietra Tumey decided she would rewrite her own destiny by masquerading as a member of the Guggenheim family. According to the New York Times, she didn't do so in a subtle way. She reportedly brandished forged Guggenheim letterhead and tossed around astronomical figures, promising oil and diamond deals worth anywhere between $1 and $3 billion. When news of this scam trickled out into public view, It raised eyebrows, not just among the people she targeted, but also within high society circles, prompting whispers about how a con artist could so brazenly invoke the Guggenheim name without immediate backlash. The most striking part of the story is how the actual Guggenheim clan chose to handle the fiasco. Rather than offering furious statements or launching high-profile lawsuits, they remained conspicuously silent, which many observers interpreted as a strategic move to protect the reputation of Guggenheim Partners, one of the family's significant financial arms. Of course, that decision set off another round of rumors. Some wondered whether the family didn't want to stir the pot, or if they simply didn't see any reason to dignify Toomey's claims with a response. Ultimately, the official narrative is pretty straightforward. The Guggenheim name was misappropriated by an outsider, the con was exposed, and claims that the family itself was somehow complicit have been widely dismissed as baseless. But how did this entire scandal unfold, and why does it resonate so strongly with the tradition of imposters attaching themselves to storied dynasties like the Guggenheims, Astors, or Rockefellers? First, it helps to understand why the Guggenheim identity would be such an appealing target for a fraudster in the first place. The Guggenheim family has a long-standing aura of prestige. Think major museums, philanthropic grants, an industrial fortune that once rivaled the Rockefellers, and a financial powerhouse in the form of Guggenheim Partners, which manages hundreds of billions of dollars in assets. All of that amounts to a nearly irresistible brand. If someone wants to pose as a scion of a wealthy clan to reel in big investments, attaching the Guggenheim surname to a business proposal instantly adds a veneer of gravitas. In a world where emails fly back and forth at lightning speed, and many deals are initiated online before culminating in face-to-face meetings, it's not entirely shocking that a cunning individual could slip through the cracks, forging documents that appear legitimate. For those on the receiving end of these opportunities, the promise of oil or diamond ventures worth billions is mouthwatering, especially if they believe they're dealing with a member of a family whose name carries historical weight and a track record of financial success. Toomey's approach involved presenting herself as a liaison or a representative of the Guggenheims, brandishing official-looking letterhead, and dropping references to philanthropic or investment initiatives. She allegedly pitched deals that sounded too good to pass up, possibly banking on prospective investors being starstruck by the Guggenheim mystique or worried they might lose out on a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity if they didn't move quickly. For context, a few business publications, including Bloomberg and A Brief Mention, have highlighted how scam artists frequently exploit well-known brand identities to create a sense of urgency and authenticity. Act now, or these billions will go to someone else. If you think about it, the technique parallels classic con artistry methods. Conjure an air of exclusivity, leverage a revered name, and propose a payoff so huge that people's skepticism might falter. But the Guggenheims themselves? They have spent generations building clout in various domains. The family started rising to prominence in the 19th and early 20th centuries through mining, smelting, and strategic acquisitions, eventually ranking among the richest clans in America. If we jump forward to modern times, Guggenheim Partners stands as a major financial institution that has been involved in high-profile deals and asset management. Some estimate the firm's assets under management at over $200 billion, with certain references pushing that figure closer to $300 billion. That's an enormous sum, enough to ensure that any mention of Guggenheim in an investment context can open doors. The last thing the family or the firm would want is to be dragged into a messy scandal involving a brazen imposter. Indeed, they had every incentive to handle the matter quietly. An official lawsuit or dramatic statements could have generated a storm of negative publicity, overshadowing all the philanthropic and financial achievements they had accumulated. So it's not surprising that, as the New York Times mentioned, the Guggenheims chose silence, letting the legal process run its course and trusting that the facts would eventually come to light. What exactly happened to Caterina Pietrotumei is a question that leads into a maze of court documents and victim statements. Some of these can be found if one digs around in public records or follows up on coverage from reputable media outlets, though the coverage was not as extensive as, say, some of the bigger financial scandals that involve hundreds of victims. The authorities eventually caught on to Tumei's fraudulent activities, culminating in legal repercussions. Victims or potential victims presumably provided statements detailing how they were approached, what kind of financial commitments they almost made, and how they discovered the con. The storyline feels reminiscent of the infamous Clark Rockefeller scandal, where a German man named Christian Gerhardsreiter impersonated a member of the Rockefeller family. He successfully fooled numerous people for years, even marrying into respectable circles and living under the assumption that nobody would question the Rockefeller name. When the real Rockefellers found out, they essentially opted for a hands-off approach. Like the Guggenheims, they saw no benefit in giving an imposter more publicity. Eventually, the law dealt with Gerhardsreiter, and the Clark Rockefeller fiasco went down in history as a stark reminder that even the most storied dynasties can be exploited by cunning outsiders. That parallel between the Rockefeller case and the Guggenheim imposter fiasco illuminates a broader phenomenon. Wealthy, well-known dynastic families are magnets for impersonation. The Astors had their own share of individuals over the decades claiming ties or forging credentials to wedge themselves into the family's social or financial circles. There's something about the mystique of an old money name that can still bend ears, especially in certain industries or among those who believe that big money might show up with a philanthropic veneer or a massive business proposition. While the internet has made verifying identities somewhat easier, it also allows scammers to create elaborate online presences. In the case of Tumei, she had letterhead. She may well have had phone lines and email accounts that used domain names, suggesting a tie to the Guggenheims, enough at least, to convince some people to proceed with negotiations or show serious interest. From a psychological angle, scams like these also highlight a certain vulnerability in people's desire to believe in remarkable opportunities. If you hear that a Guggenheim is on board, your suspicion might drop. That's precisely the Achilles heel that con artists count on. Similarly, the mention of $1 to $3 billion in oil and diamond deals is so grandiose that it can override an otherwise rational person's inclination to do thorough due diligence. They see the potential for exponential returns, or at least they see themselves rubbing elbows with a storied family, which might open even bigger doors down the road. By the time they realize something is off, they could already be in too deep, having signed preliminary documents or parted with large sums of money. Thankfully, it appears in this case that law enforcement intervened before she pulled off a truly catastrophic haul. Although the exact total of what she might have garnered remains murky, overshadowed by the more sensational headlines about the forgery and the bold name dropping. For the Guggenheims, the scandal posed a dual threat. On one hand, letting the public know that someone was impersonating a member of the family could cause potential embarrassment and tarnish the aura of exclusivity that the name holds. Nobody wants to be seen as the victim of a con, especially when the name connotes power and wealth. On the other hand, ignoring it or handling it too quietly could invite speculation that maybe there was more to the story, that the family was somehow complicit, or that there were shady dealings happening behind the scenes. That latter theory appears to be nothing more than rumor. There's no credible evidence that the Guggenheims or Guggenheim partners had anything to do with Toomey's scheme. In fact, that rumor falls neatly into the same category as other baseless claims that swirl around large families, like the idea that the family might sponsor an imposter to launder money or test the waters of a new market. All indications suggest the Guggenheims wanted absolutely nothing to do with this fiasco and simply recognized that pursuing the matter publicly might escalate it unnecessarily.